Hi, Jeremy Crow here. This video I wanted to tell a little bit about my personal experience with esoteric and Gnostic forms of Christianity. So back when I first started getting involved with the esoteric, I actually had been a Roman Catholic growing up, and very early on I felt a strong calling to the priesthood, but as I learned more and more, I realized that I wasn't suited to be a Catholic priest. For one thing, I wanted to have a family. That's something that I always was very interested in, having a family at some point. And so being a Catholic priest, you're not going to be having a family. You're supposed to vow celibacy, right? And dedicate your life to the church. I wasn't going to do that. Also, as I learned more about the Catholic Church, there was more and more about it that I disagreed with. But I did still have that very strong calling to the priesthood. So I started exploring various different alternate spiritual systems, alternate religions, including Buddhism and neo-paganism. None of those really clicked with me that strongly, although I did find a lot of them very interesting, and I did come back to that later and had a much stronger interest in some of those forms of spirituality later. But I was still kind of caught up in that whole Catholic current, you could call it. And so one of the things that I did find very interesting early on was Golden Dawn style ritual magic, and I was practicing that on my own for a while, and then I got involved with an esoteric branch of Freemasonry, and I have a bunch of videos about that more in depth. I'm not going to talk about that in particular, but through that I did find there were a lot of theosophists, people that were members of the Theosophical Society that was originally founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, HPB, people used to call her for short. Blavatsky started this group, and there were also some of these people that were involved with both Theosophy and this esoteric branch of Freemasonry. They were also, some of them were involved with the liberal Catholic Church. And so I explored that a little bit. Now, what the liberal Catholic Church is, it was started by, I believe it was Leadbeater. And he was a prominent theosophist, and he claimed to be clairvoyant, or being able to see subtle energies. And so he examined the Catholic rituals and tried to kind of understand what was going on a more subtle level, on an esoteric level. And he got really elaborate with that. And what he did is he ended up reforming a lot of these rituals, the sacraments, the main ceremonies of the Catholic Church, and he formed the liberal Catholic Church, where it was a more esoteric version of the Catholic Church. Now, he ended up getting ordained and consecrated as a bishop, ordained as a priest first, and then consecrated as a bishop later by the old Catholic Church, and then used that authority to form the liberal Catholic Church, which was almost like a branch of the old Catholic Church. Now, if you look at the lineage of the old Catholic Church, that was a breakaway from the Roman Catholic Church. So it actually has that same apostolic succession, which means an unbroken chain of bishops, essentially. One bishop consecrating the next, and so on and so forth, all the way back to, as the Roman Catholic Church claims, back to Peter, the apostle, and from him to Jesus. And they say that when Jesus said, "You are the rock upon which my church shall be built," and then he changed Simon's name to Peter, and Peter means rock, that Peter became the first bishop of the Roman Catholic Church. And then from there, there's supposedly an unbroken chain of initiation, you could call it, or consecration. And so the liberal Catholic Church had that apostolic succession through the old Catholic Church. Now, I got involved with that through some of the members of the through the Freemasonry, and the esoteric version of the Freemasonry that I was a part of. And I'm not saying that the mainstream version of Freemasonry is not esoteric. It's just not as focused on that aspect. But the one that I was a part of was very esoterically oriented, and there were some of the very high level members, some 33rd degree members, were also liberal Catholic priests. And so I experienced the Eucharist through them several times, and I really enjoyed it. It was something that I felt very strongly connected with through my, upbringing. And so when I got more interested in that, I found a priest here in Toronto who was performing the Mass on a regular basis. He was actually a full-time priest. And now the liberal Catholic Church was so small that they couldn't afford to pay their priests, so he had to work as basically freelance for officiating weddings and more often funerals. So he would do funerals, and he would do more of a slightly less esoteric version of the Mass. I mean, it wasn't very explicitly esoteric anyways, but he would do a ceremony that was intended for kind of a generic audience, and he would get paid for doing that. And that was how he made his living. He didn't have very much money, but he worked really, really hard so that he could be a full-time priest. And I was kind of studying under him for a while, and I was kind of an unofficial deacon for him here in Toronto for a little while. And then he kind of just disappeared one day. I lent him a book, a novel by Catherine Kurtz called The Adept. And I still haven't been able to find a replacement for it. The first book. It was a really good story, a good novel, interesting. I found it fun. But anyways, he kind of disappeared, and I lost track. Nobody knew what happened to him. He kind of just fell off the face of the planet. But around the same time that I was, just before he disappeared, I got into contact with Bishop Karl Emanuel of the Gnostic Church of the Glorious Christ. So this was a Gnostic church that was in communion with a lot of the really large Gnostic churches that around the world, but it had its direct lineage back to a Gnostic church in Barbados called the Gnostic Church of the Glorious Christ. But we had our own branch here in Canada called the Gnostic Church of the Glorious Christ in Canada. And Carl, he was the bishop of Canada, essentially. He didn't have any other bishops under him, so he wasn't technically an archbishop, but essentially the same role. Now, I asked him if he would train me, and he accepted. I mean, he asked me a bunch of questions, and at that time, I had already kind of realized that I had this resonance with the kind of the Luciferian current. And I explained to him what I meant by that, and he agreed. And he said, you know what, most of what you said I agree with, and I have no problem taking you on as a student. And so we would meet up every single week, and sometimes twice a week. So it was roughly around, most months it was about 6 times a month. And usually we would do one or another version of the Gnostic Mass. We had about 3 main versions of the Gnostic Mass that we would perform, including ones that were more traditional to the Gnostic Church of the Glorious Christ as derived from Barbados, but also we did one that was more in use in the United States, like Stephen Heller, Bishop Stephen Heller. You might have heard of him. He was actually good friends with Carl Emanuel, and so we used one of the ones that he was using a lot, and there was another one that we would use often too. And we would refer to the Science of the Sacraments, a book by Leadbeater, on the liberal Catholic Church versions of these same sacraments, these same ceremonies, these same core ceremonies. And we would study them in depth. And in addition, we were studying the, he was very well knowledgeable in this stuff, but he was teaching me, and he was telling me, giving me assignments of what things to read, and I would read them, and we would discuss them when we got together, and I would talk with him on the phone. And it was essentially a seminary. We called it seminary, but it was a direct tutelage from him being a teacher and me the student. And we studied the Nag Hammadi text quite in depth, as well as some material from like Carl Jung, like the 7 Sermons of the Dead, and various different Gnostic texts, including the Pistis Sophia, some of these other ones by Mead. That was a text that was published by, there was a couple initials I can't remember off the top of my head. I just finished a 12-hour night shift. But we studied a lot of these different texts, and we would discuss them and explore the various meanings behind them. And that went on for about 4 years. That went on. And during that time, I was ordained through the various different holy orders, and we used the same basic structure of initiation, you could call it, that the liberal Catholic Church outlined in the Science of the Sacraments. So we went through like acolyte and exorcist. That was a cool title that I had for a while, up to and including subdeacon, deacon, and eventually priest. Now, so I'm an ordained Gnostic priest in the Gnostic tradition through the lineage of Carl Emanuel, who went by Tau Sorenthus. And at the, I was being groomed for a leadership role in the church there, and he wanted me to ultimately become a bishop as well. But in that tradition, you wouldn't become a bishop until you were at least 40 years old, and I was, in my early 20s. So that was not even, that wasn't even in the picture. But there was that concept or that implication that ultimately I would become a bishop. Now, once I did get ordained as a priest, I was I actually served as the primary officiant in the local Gnostic Church in Toronto. So that's something I hadn't mentioned up to this point, but there was a congregation in Toronto. And so a lot of the times I would do the deacon role for a lot of these ceremonies, for the regular Mass, really. And we only did the regular Mass publicly once a month. But there were other rituals that we were participating in as well. As part of my seminary, I also was initiated into the Martinist Order. Now, in Toronto, that Martinist Order that I was a part of actually went under more than one banner. over the various different years, but it was still the same core group. Originally, it was the traditional Martinist Order, but ultimately it ended up changing names and such. This video is getting a little long, so I'm going to skip over a bit of that, but one interesting aspect of that is that when I finally got my third degree, I didn't get the free initiator degree, which was kind of equivalent to bishop in a sense, where you could make other free initiators. But I did get to the point of superior inconnu, which means unknown superior in French. It was kind of a French mystic Christian Gnostic esoteric order that was very similar to Freemasonry in a lot of ways. We had very similar ritual setup, and we were operating out of an Orange Lodge that we were renting, because the setup of an Orange Lodge is very interesting, and it's very Masonic in its temple structure. And so we would use that building, we rented it, for the rituals that we were performing, including the Martinist Order ceremonies that we were performing, as well as the regular monthly Gnostic Mass that we were performing as well. So we went through all that, and when I got my superior inconnu, you're supposed to pick a magical gnomon, you could call it, your initiated name. And I told my bishop that I wanted to pick Lucifer as my initiated name, my magical gnomon. And he was like, well, I get what you mean, but the congregation here, they're not going to get it. So he made me pick Lucian. And I kind of felt a little bitter about that, because Lucian is such a common kind of go-to name for people in the left-hand path to utilize as kind of their name. There's too many Lucians out there. And I was like, I don't really want to do it, but whatever, I'll do it because you want me to do it like that. And because if they're not going to get it, then I'm not going to go out there and they're going to think that I'm, something that I'm not. And they're going to reject it anyways, right? Because they have to vote on it as well. There was a vote at one point. So, and it's really interesting. I'm not going to give away the thing, but there's kind of an interesting challenge in that ceremony. But that kind of was a bit of a turning point for me, because I didn't want to hide the fact that I resonated with the Luciferian current. And so that led me to eventually become inactive in the Gnostic Church there. And I went off and I explored some other traditions, including the OTO. I ended up becoming an initiate of the Ordo Templi Orientis, which is Aleister Crowley's Masonic organization, you could say. His Masonic style order that he established, or he didn't establish it, but you might as well say he did. He became an early member, and he ended up rewriting all of the rituals. So, I mean, it kind of became a new organization once all the rituals were rewritten. So, anyways, everybody thinks of it as Aleister Crowley's order anyways. But I'm getting off on a sidetrack here. But yeah, so that was near the end when I was a priest, and I was serving that local congregation as the primary officiant, and Carl took a step back, and he kind of was almost took like a past master role, if you know the role in Freemasonry. But this was for the church. So he kind of sat to the side, and he would oversee the ceremonies and be there and have his presence, but I was the one doing the main Eucharist and, singing the various hymns and various things like that. And I was the one doing like the, ceremony as the primary. And I had a couple deacons that were coming up as well. So that was a very interesting experience for me. And ultimately, part of the reason that I didn't want to hide my resonance with Luciferianism anymore was also my experience in the esoteric Freemasonry that I was a part of as well, because I found out that there were several members at the top that were also Luciferians, and they were hiding it from almost everybody in the order. There were a lot of people who wouldn't have accepted that if they knew. And it felt like they were being used for their resources, for their time, their energy, and their money. That they were being used by the people because they were hiding who they really were in order to convince these people to continue to be members. And sometimes some of the people would find out, and they would be like having this like existential crisis. They were like, well, have I been, worshiping Satan this whole time? And they would have these conversations. They'd be like, don't tell the other members, but this is what we mean by it, and they would explain it. And most of the time they would stay, and they would be like, oh, okay. I get it, I think, but it's going to take me some time to process this. And they would stay most of the time, but it would be a big shock to them. And I felt like there was something wrong about keeping that hidden from the main membership. And I was starting to see that sort of thing happening with the Gnostic Church as well. And there was a lot of bishops that were in the United States. There was about 3 main Gnostic churches, not Aleister Crowley affiliated, not the EGC I'm talking about. I'm talking about more Christian Gnostic churches in the United States. Like some of them had very similar names to EGC, but they weren't Thelemic. But a lot of the clergy were secretly interested, at least, very interested at least, in the Luciferian current. And I had set up this online study group using a pseudonym, which was an Enochian word. Luciftius Peripsol was the name that I was going by at first, because I didn't know if people would accept this idea. And I was like I said, I was being told that the main membership weren't going to accept it. And so I set up this online study group through Yahoo email groups called Darkness Visible. And I ended up finding a bunch of the clergy members, including bishops, especially from the United States, of the Gnostic churches that we were in communion with, joining my Luciferian study group. And some of them bishops and some of them priests. And and then I ended up realizing, well, why am I keeping this secret, who I am? And I sent the message, and I was like, it's me, it's Jeremy, And I'm like, oh, Jeremy, oh, yeah, I was curious, and I'm really, interested in a lot of this stuff, and but, a lot of my congregation don't know. And so I'd appreciate it if you kept it on the down low. And so I was seeing this like pervasive Luciferian interest, and people who are resonating with the Luciferian current, especially at the higher levels of this. And I really didn't like the idea that we were kind of keeping it secret from the main congregation, and I felt like using them, like I said. So that's one of the reasons that I stepped away from being an active clergy member in the Gnostic Church. I did do some things later, like I ended up doing a wedding for somebody, and I did a baptism for that same couple's child, their first child, a Gnostic version of it, a Gnostic wedding, a Gnostic baptism. And I did, perform, you know, priestly duties here and there for friends that requested it of me, but I wasn't actively serving a congregation after that initial first year of being a priest and regularly serving the Toronto congregation. But yeah, that's my main experience with esoteric and Gnostic Christianity. It turned out that it ended up being very Luciferian, just at the higher levels, and secretive. Which is why I kind of ended up branching off and going into more explicitly Luciferian currents and joining various different groups and even starting them. And the rest is history. You can look up what I've done since then. And I hope you enjoyed that story, my experience with that. I do videos like this all the time, usually at least 2 per week. So if you like this, I hope you subscribe to my channel and like the video, share it with your friends. YouTube's been deranking my videos considerably. Almost every one now gets demonetized, at least in the first 24 hours. Sometimes it does end up getting remonetized later after all the initial rush of views comes in, which is kind of a big trick that YouTube is doing, I guess. But hopefully you enjoyed the video, and until next time, everybody, stay lucid.